I just invite you to just have a seat. The minister is here, so we're about to get started. So I am Floyd Wilson. I am one of the investment advisors here at Mayberry Investments, and I will be your host for the evening. I'd like to welcome you to our first investor forum for the 2020 series. So the Mayberry Investor Series is celebrating its 23rd year this year, and over the years it has become the standard bearer for investor briefings and investor education in Jamaica. Throughout the years, we have managed to invite some of the brightest minds to share their insights, experience, and expertise with our clients, investors, associates, and friends. In an age where information is at our fingertips, we continue to offer valuable information to our audiences by giving them useful, applicable information to help them navigate the ever-changing financial and business landscape, not just here in Jamaica, but also in the overseas markets, as well as the opportunity to network with some of the key players in our business community. This evening, we are joined by the Minister of Finance, the Honorable Nigel Clarke, who is opening our annual forum series for the second time. Welcome back, Minister. And we're also looking forward to having you in years to come. Also joining us on stage is our CEO. I think the Minister likes to hear that. He's going to be here. Also joining us on stage is our CEO, Mr. Gary Peart. But before we go any further, I'd like to invite Michelle Lang, one of our investment advisors, to come and open us in prayer.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let us pause for prayer. Our kind, dear, precious Heavenly Father, we thank you for this another day. We thank you for health. We thank you for strength. We thank you for everything that you have provided for us. As we meet here this afternoon to discuss what is before us, we ask, dear God, that you guide these proceedings. In Jesus' name, I pray. Amen.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for blessing us. Right now, I'm going to invite Mr. Peart to come and give opening remarks. After that, the Minister will come and address us.
Thank you, Floyd. Every year we start our first forum with the Minister of Finance, and we've been doing this for a couple of decades now. And what's interesting, I think it's the first time, I don't know if everybody heard that Minister Clarke was going to be here, because there's gridlock from all the different three entrances in Oxford Boulevard. I don't know if he's coming to tell us about reduction in taxes, but let me not speak for him. Good night, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, as I said, for our first Mayberry Forum for 2020. This is our 23rd year for the Mayberry Forum and our 35th year of Mayberry being in business. Can you imagine? 3 decades and a half, Mr. Berry. Congrats to your dad. Today we'll be reflecting on a marvelous 2019, where despite some ups and downs, our economy experienced changes that have put us on a better path towards prosperity. And of course, we also look forward to the future of our economy, one that we know will be filled with even more growth and affluence. Jamaica, as blessed as she is, our industries continue to grow, its upward swing evident in the many facets of our economy. And perhaps no one is more aware of this than our distinguished guest speaker for this evening, Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clarke, MP, Minister of Finance and Public Affairs. The Minister's history in finance and economics is expansive, to say the least. Not only is he now Minister of Finance and Public Service, but from 2013 to 2015, he also served as Ambassador of Economic Affairs. There he represented Jamaica's interests with multilateral institutions. During that time, he also wore the hat of Senator in the upper house of the Jamaican Parliament. Minister Clark is an avid businessman with a mind hardwired for growth. You know, this growth is just a recurring theme, bubbling up. His prolific career in the public sector demonstrates this, as he was chairman of the National Housing Trust, chairman of the Port Authority of Jamaica, and chairman of the Heart Trust. To be noted also in his private sector career, which spanned 2 decades, Dr. Clark was a businessman and a financier. Prior to public office, Dr. Clark served as deputy chairman and CFO of a diversified regional conglomerate and chairman of a publicly traded investment firm. Aside from serving as a non-executive director, chairman or vice chairman of several companies listed on the Jamaica Stock Exchange, Minister Clark has also dabbled in entrepreneurism. And by dabble, I mean he has seen major successes in that arena as well. Minister Clark is a proud recipient of the PSOJ's Under 50 Business Leader Award, as well as the Kiwanis community. But I think you've heard enough from me. It's about time you heard from the man himself. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark.
I wonder if I can have Gary introduce me more often.
For our fee.
Ladies and gentlemen of the Mayberry community, good evening. It is good that Jamaica has a growing community of persons who are interested in finance and interested in investment and interested in knowing about the economy and how it's going. Clearly, Mayberry has been doing this for a long time, but one of the things that we have seen over the past 12 to 18, maybe 24 months is the emergence of a social media phenomenon where persons are constantly talking about all things economics, all things finance, and that can only be good for Jamaica. The more we realize that we are invested in Jamaica's future and we share a common destiny despite any differences that may exist, it's the better that we'll perform over time. This evening I've been asked to speak about the economy over the past year and to open the budget debate here this evening. 2019-20 was a very significant year, the financial year, beginning in April 1st of 2019, ending March 31st of 2020, a very significant year in Jamaica's economic history. One of the most significant events that occurred during this financial year would have been the successful completion of the $1.6 billion standby arrangement that Jamaica had with the IMF. And you will recall that this would have been the second successive IMF program that Jamaica would have executed faithfully, and it was only the second time in Jamaica's entire history that we have actually completed 2 fund programs back to back. And those interested in statistics, I would say it's actually the first time that we have completed a fund program, because the EFF, you will recall, we brought to a premature end in order to enter the precautionary standby arrangement. But it's very significant, and you are all aware of the progress we made under the precautionary standby arrangement from 2016 to 2019, and you're all aware of the progress under the EFF from 2013 until November of 2016. One thing I'll share with you, though, is the interest that the international community has had in Jamaica's performance over this time. In October, around about the time that the fund program was ending, it coincided with the annual meeting of the IMF and the World Bank. And at that meeting, you have finance ministers, finance officials, central bank governors from all 188 members of the fund who converge on DC, and there are a series of seminars and workshops and so forth. Jamaica was highly featured throughout that series, and on one particular seminar, I was asked to speak about Jamaica's performance or experience with the fund and how and why were we successful. If I tell you that we only had standing room in Washington, D.C. for that seminar, it was, the room was, all the seats were filled and people were standing. Well, I guess just like here. And, Jamaica's, your achievement, the achievement of all Jamaicans, it resonates around the world because of the exceptional nature of it and how it departs from our history. And indeed, it departs from the experience, the contemporary experience of other countries. Now, one of the signal or significant or something that signifies where Jamaica is today and where we weren't before is that macroeconomic stability has become entrenched. And what do I mean by macroeconomic stability? Well, macro stability has a couple of components, and I would have written about this before. External stability, fiscal and debt sustainability, price stability, and the fourth pillar would be financial stability. I'll come to that. I'll speak about the first three. The fourth one is a much more technical area and is more the preserve of the Bank of Jamaica. For a long time, Jamaica has been in a position where we have been externally unsustainable, and that is what has brought us to the IMF on each and every occasion. We don't go to the fund because we don't have money for hospitals or we don't have money for roads or for education. We ended up going to the IMF, which is a multilateral institution, because our ability to pay our external bills as they become due, that ability is compromised. And they come in, they lend money or provide a guarantee to our central bank and agree on a set of reform measures. And each and every one of the 16 times that we've gone to the IMF from 1962 has been because we have had insufficient reserves. We would have ended the fund program with the measure of reserves being far in excess of what is technically required, providing a buffer in the event of external shocks. And external shocks is not some capital market activity, somebody raising money on the stock market, and therefore there's need for funds. An external shock is if there were a sustained rise in the price of oil for an extended period of time that would have a drag on reserves. You want to have more than you need for such a period. Similarly, if there were a natural disaster event and production came to a halt and we had to import all that we needed for 6 months, you want to make sure that you have sufficient buffer for events like that. But Jamaica, we have earned that position by virtue of the reforms that we have made. And between 2016 and 2019, we would have added over $1 billion of non-borrowed reserves to the central bank. So yes, the central bank had reserves, but a lot of it was borrowed, meaning that at some point in time, it had to be paid back. Since October 2016 and October 2019, between that period, the central bank added $1 billion of reserves that were not borrowed reserves. Now, the second component of the stability that I define is the fact that our fiscal accounts are sustainable, meaning that if you were to, we don't have commitments that would lead over the medium term to the budget being unable to be financed. And that has not been our history because we're coming from a place where just two items of expenditure, wages and interest, in many years were larger than tax revenues. Hard to believe from the viewpoint of today, but that has been Jamaica's reality. But where we are now and the way in which our fiscal affairs are managed, we have a sustainable path over the medium term. And that is not something that we should ever seek to compromise. And the sustainability of our medium-term fiscal path is founded upon a sustainable debt trajectory. And as you know, what happened to us over a period of time is our debt became unsustainable, meaning that we borrowed so much that we couldn't sustain the position that we were in. The only plug would be that debt would just continue to spiral out of control. And clearly, we're not in that position today. We're in a position where we're in a trajectory where the trajectory of debt is firmly downward. And then the third area of stability that has eluded Jamaica for all of my lifetime is price stability. The fact that we have had inflation not in 1 year, not in 2 years, not in 3 years, but for 4 years, being in the region of 5% or less. And again, those of you who are old enough can recall what runaway inflation looks like and what it feels like. It's not the kind of, you will always have instances where we have complaints and things that are not right and so on. But those who can remember what the definition of high inflation and what it leads to, those causes and those effects are not present here today. And what is significant about this is that Jamaica, for at least 5 decades, at least going back to the 1970s, I can't speak for the 60s, Jamaica has never had price stability, external sustainability, and fiscal sustainability all at the same time. And that's what makes this time very special. And we must endeavor and commit among ourselves that we, come what may, we're not going to lose those elements of stability. Because, yes, stability is not sufficient. You can't stop there. But it is absolutely necessary. Without it, nothing else can really function. And we know that. That's the great thing about where we are today, is that we have learned from experience what works and what clearly is not in our interest. During 2019, we would have had 2 credit upgrades from 2 separate international credit rating agencies. S&P upgraded Jamaica to the highest rating that they have assigned Jamaica in 20 years. And Moody's upgraded Jamaica to the highest rating that it had ever assigned Jamaica in over 10 years. And when you speak to those rating agencies, and those of you who are in the bond market and trade Jamaica bonds would know that our bonds have for some time traded above our particular rating. Yeah? And the rating agencies were just playing catch up. And when you speak to them, you know, and as you know, when you rate a country, it's a multifaceted exercise. You're looking at a number of areas of the economy and of the society. Because when you're assessing the credit rating of a country, you're not only interested in the stability of the economy, you're interested in the stability of the society as well. So many factors come into play. And when they assessed Jamaica, they said, look, you know, if the debt were lower, meaning we score high on many, many facets, but the level of the debt is still high. And if you were to plot a chart of the countries that are trading at the premium that our bonds trade over treasuries, you'd find that we would be an outlier with respect to the level of the debt that we have, which tells you how well we are doing and the confidence in Jamaica, that despite that our debt is higher than the others in our class, we end up with the same rating that they have. And that should serve as an encouragement for us to continue. And so, you know, up until recently, we had at least one or two, and I could be mistaken on this, but certainly Barbados was investment grade a couple of years ago, and Bahamas, I believe, would have been within CARICOM. Trinidad might have been, but I don't know if they would reach investment grade. But today, that's certainly not the case. But I don't want to speak about Jim. I don't want to speak about other countries. It must be our ambition to, at some point, become a country whose credit can be assessed as investment grade. That has to be our ambition. Now, the road to getting there is a long one. It's not something that we can achieve overnight. Certainly, the trajectory that we are on with respect to our fiscal and debt affairs will put us in good stead. But simply getting to a debt GDP ratio of 60%, that in and of itself would not get us to investment grade. We'd have to also have very meaningful reforms in other areas of the economy and of the society as well. But that has to be a goal. And the reason why is that once you are investment grade, well, let's put it this way, in the same way that the FSC regulates pension funds and institutional funds from life insurance companies and the investments that are permissible for these funds, and investments that are permissible are investments that have a certain credit rating, so it is also the case that international institutional investors are prevented from investing in Jamaica, many of them, because of credit rating being lower than investment grade. So becoming investment grade credit would open up to Jamaica vast amounts of resources, the likes of which we have never had access to in our history, and would usher in a new era for Jamaica. So that has to be the long-term goal that we're all united in, that we want to be among the community of nations that is seen as a safe harbor for investment, and where we can attract capital from the most conservative pension and institutional funds in the world. Now, to do that, we're definitely going to have to elevate the levels of growth that we have. And certainly, the levels of growth over the course of the fund program and today have been lower than we would have wanted them to be. But it's important to look behind the headline numbers. If you're really interested in what is happening, I used to love mathematics in school, and one thing you learn in math is that when you see a function, no matter what the function looks like, you can decompose it into the summation of lots of different waves of different frequencies. So one wave is doing this, one is doing this, all right? But if you just look at the sum, you will miss what is happening underneath. And there's some very interesting things that are happening with respect to growth that I want to just share with you. The first, obviously, is that we have had 19 consecutive quarters of growth, which is not to be underlooked because we've never had it before. We only started measuring growth quarterly in 1997. And since 1997, we've never had an unbroken stretch of 19 consecutive quarters of economic growth. We not only measure growth for the entire economy, but we decompose the economy into its constituent sectors and measure growth for each sector. And there are about 11 sectors, and one of them we split. Manufacturing, we split into beverages, etc., and then another category called other manufacturing. But if you look at the headline categories, there are 11. They're the goods categories of mining, construction, manufacturing, agriculture, and services, I won't name all of them, such as hotel and restaurants, electricity, banking and finance, wholesale and retail, and installation, and so forth, right? 11 in total. Now, in the last, this financial year, we would have been severely impacted by external events. And those external events would have led to the closure of the Jiska Alpat plant, which meant that that sector in the third quarter declined by nearly 20%. And the projection is for the fourth quarter ending December, just gone, the decline in that sector will probably be even higher. And the overhang will probably go to the first quarter of this year. Oh, well, not first, it will overhang into first quarter of 2020 and maybe even second, not necessarily to the same degree, but there will be a hangover. And that alone would have been sufficient to drag growth down considerably from where it was projected to be to where it ended up. So for 2019-20, we're expecting growth for the entire financial year of about 0.7 or 0.8%. The first point I want to make with respect to growth is that while we look on what is happening in Jamaica, we have to be aware of the regional context. And when you look at Jamaica's growth versus the average growth for Latin America and the Caribbean, you will see that for financial years, for example, 2010-11, 11-12, 12-13, 13-14, 14-15, Jamaica would have been way below the Latin American and Caribbean average, and some of those years we were actually negative. For the last 2 years, not for the last 2 years, for the last 4 years, we have been above the average of Latin America and the Caribbean. And even in this year, where our growth has gone below 1 to 0.7, it's still higher than the average of Latin America and the Caribbean, which is 0.2. And the reason why that's important is that the same external factors that impact Jamaica are impacting the region as well, which is a phenomena of much lower commodity prices. And the lower commodity prices impact us through the price of alumina, which has led to the temporary closure of the Jiska plant. With respect to Latin America, it impacts them in similar ways. So the context is important. But the other thing that is important is that when you look at the sectors, in the third quarter of this calendar year and in the second quarter, of the 11 sectors in Jamaica, we had growth in 8 out of the 11, in both the second and in the third quarter. And that would be missing when you just look at the headline number. So 8 of our sectors grew, and we had problem with agriculture, with mining, and with construction. Construction we can understand, and that's repairable, and the reason for that was that the South Coast Highway, the government is a big spender when it comes to construction, certainly in recent times. The year before, we'd have spent $28 billion on the Mid-P program, Mandela Highway, Constant Spring, Hagley Park, Barbican, etc. So when you compare 28 billion and then you have the year that follows and the South Coast Highway doesn't get off the ground on time, then it impacts construction. So the construction one is fixable and it's not external. But certainly the mining is external and we are impacted by the drought in agriculture. But when you can have 8 of your 11 sectors growing, that is a good thing. And then when you look at the history of the last 4 years, and I've just looked at it over the last, since 2016, between 2016 and today, we have had on average 9 out of 11 sectors growing every single quarter. But what has happened is that we have some big waves that dampen out what is happening with the vast majority. Our legacy industries of mining and the big parts of agriculture have had huge swings in output, going up by double digits. So we went through 2017 where Mining was down 10%, down 11%, down 15%, quarter over quarter, for all of those 4 quarters. Then you go into 2018 and mining was up 30%, up 40%, up 50%. Then you come into 2019 and mining is down 18%, down 40%. And those movements in those traditional areas have completely masked what is happening elsewhere. Which is why people have a problem understanding the employment numbers, and I'll get to that in a second. Right? So if you were to strip away, and you can't strip away because they're part of the economy, but for you to understand what is happening, and if you were to, just like you would do in your business, if you have a portfolio of 11 businesses, right, you would, and you have your P&L at the end, you have some things that are giving you real problems. You want to understand what your core earnings are, right, with taking out these variables. If you were to take your core, those 8 or 9 that have been growing consistently and don't have these swings, it tells an entirely different story, which gives us hope. Are you with me? Yeah. So for a Mayberry audience, we can go beyond the headline and look into what the headline is composed of to understand what is really happening. And if you can have over 4 years, 9 of your 11 sectors growing, not necessarily the same 9, but 9 of 11 growing every single quarter, that tells you that something is happening, and something good is happening. And it explains the employment numbers, which I'll get to in a second. Suffice to say, however, that we are going to have to do a lot of things to accelerate the level of growth towards what our projections are, which is the IMF projects medium-term growth for Jamaica of 2 to 2.5% over the medium term. For the next financial year, as I described to you, because we will still have the effects of bauxite alumina, we've already gone public and said the PIOJ has projected growth, just over 1% for the next financial year. And again, but if you're dominate mining playing a huge role in that. Now, let's talk a little bit about the employment numbers. Jamaica, the Statin just released the unemployment numbers for October 2019. And Jamaica has never had unemployment as low as we have it today, at 7.2%. You go back. You go back for 57 years, you will not find a year where Jamaica has had unemployment of 7.2. In fact, you won't find a year that we've had an unemployment of 8 point something either. Since between October 2015 and October 2019, and I choose because in labor data, you really want to measure the same month in the year with the same month because employment is seasonal, right? Many people have, if to get a true sense of what's going on, you don't compare October with January or October with March. You ought to compare October with October. So between October 2015 and October 2019, over 100,000 jobs were created. You heard what I just said? That is, the labor force would have started at 1.15, and today is 1.25. When you have a labor force of 1.1 million, to add 100,000, meaning to expand the labor force by 10% over 4 years, you show me an example like that anywhere in our neighborhood. It just doesn't exist. It is a signature achievement. And people look at it and say, okay, how could we be having this employment growth? And we're seeing underlying growth, as I just described. Well, the reason is you have to look behind the headline because you're having 8 or 9 of your sectors which account for most of the employment. Those sectors are growing, but the headline is dominated by these volatile areas like mining that employ relatively few people. So mining that would have declined by 20% because of the closure of Alpart and would have dragged everything down. And just think about it. You know, mining represents about 3% of the economy. It declines by 20%. Then that's a 0.6 drag on your growth, right? It declines by 40%. That's a 1% drag on your growth. So when it moves by those numbers, and similarly if it goes up, right, it has a significant effect. But the people employed in the firms that have been affected is no more than a few hundred. So even though it has an effect on our growth number, it doesn't impact employment, because the areas that impact employment are all areas that have been growing and growing consistently. And I give you the case of manufacturing, which has been a problem for Jamaica ever since the mid-1990s. During those years when we had unsustainable fiscal and monetary policies, we had high interest rates, we had the FinSac debacle, the manufacturing sector was decimated. We had 12 consecutive quarters of negative growth. And by I mean 10%, 11%, 8% negative growth for 12 consecutive quarters. And then we had a little blip and then down again. And during the financial crisis, we had another, when Jamaica was highly indebted, going into the financial crisis was nothing but, I mean, the results would have been easily predicted. We had another 11 consecutive quarters of negative growth in manufacturing. So manufacturing in 2016 would have been 70% of what it was in 1996. Yet still, between 2016 and today, manufacturing has grown every single quarter except 2. The longest period or the most significant period of growth for manufacturing in over 25 years. In the last quarter, Q3, when the growth overall was 0.6, manufacturing grew by 4.9%. In the quarter before, manufacturing grew by 3.8%. Now, where are people employed? Manufacturing employs a fair bunch. You look at tourism. Tourism over the last 4 years, you've had some quarters 7%, some quarters 4%, some quarters 5%. Where are people employed? Many people are employed in tourism. So the record unemployment that we have achieved is perfectly compatible with the output numbers if you look at what is happening at the sectoral level. Am I making sense? Yeah. So that presents great opportunity, because it means that as employment continues to grow, the revenues that we earn from employment grow, and the firms that operate in these industries, the revenues that we earn from firms also grows, and so that puts Jamaica in a very good position. Now, as we have discussed before, we are reorganizing the way in which government works and reforming the public sector with a range of initiatives. But the one that is probably relevant for an audience like this is using the initiative of privatizations, meaning bringing assets that are owned by the government and moving them into the private sector, which achieves many objectives at the same time. And we'd have our privatization program in a prior dispensation would have been primarily through private competitive tenders, and those have their place and they've been successful. We successfully divested Norman Manley International Airport last year. That would have followed things like the Kingston Container Terminal and Petcom and other assets, the coffee assets and so forth. We have taken a firm decision that we want to expand the ownership base of the Jamaican economy. At a time that the economy is being reformed in this way, it's important that as many people as possible are able to participate in the benefits and the fruits of that reform. And that has informed the approach to divest by using the Jamaica Stock Exchange. You'd have seen in the last financial year, led by Mayberry, that Wigton was divested, and we have announced and are working feverishly on the divestment of the Trans-Jamaica Highway by way of an IPO. And as the Prime Minister mentioned yesterday at another place, we expect that to be launched fairly soon, and hope, you have to get your, I'm not an investment advisor, you have to be advised by your advisors, but with that proviso, we hope for participation and interest. And that will be closely followed by the IPO of JPS, the 19.9% shares that the government owns in JPS, and that will be followed by the IPO of Jamaica Mortgage Bank. And there are others in the pipeline as well, but too premature to mention them. So you can expect that through government activity, that the government will be contributing to the vitality and the vibrancy of the capital markets this year. And as the government deleverages and reduces its debt, we think it's strategically important to catalyze the placement of other assets that the investor wallet can be attracted to. So for 2020 and sort of looking forward, you can expect business as usual, that the government will be adhering to its own fiscal rules and crafting a budget that is consistent with that. You can expect the pipeline of infrastructure works to be accelerated. You already know that we're working on the South Coast Highway, and those of you who are not necessarily familiar with the dimensions of it, it's going to feature a 4-lane highway from Harbor View that goes for 16 miles east, and then becomes like a normal, like the North Coast Highway from there on to Port Antonio. And it's also going to extend the East-West Highway all the way to Williamsfield, which is going to make the commute between Kingston and Mandeville make it easy. But in the document for the IPO of Trans-Jamaica, the government discloses the other projects that are in the pipeline, which include many exciting things like ring roads around some of the major towns, which will make the commute on the North Coast much more effective, and other major infrastructure investments to take place over the next few years. So you're going to see, either by way of engaging the private sector to participate or through government expenditure, you're going to see infrastructure spending take center stage. And I mention it here because the modality of having private participation in infrastructure spending is going to increasingly become important. A fiscally responsible government like Jamaica's. Oh, you laugh. I'm dead serious. A fiscally responsible government like the government of Jamaica, can't possibly finance all of the capital and infrastructure requirements that are required to deliver the prosperity that the people want. We can't finance all of the investments in water that are required. The investments in water required are tremendous. We will do some of them, but over time, we've got to find ways of involving private capital while ensuring that the social attributes are not subject to market forces, right? Because water is definitely a lot of social considerations. But the investments required, as have been disclosed in Parliament from time to time, are in the order of hundreds of millions of US dollars, and the government simply, if it's focused on its objectives of health and education and security, as well as fiscal discipline, it won't be able to finance that on its own. And similarly, the investments that we require in infrastructure. And that's one of the reasons why we are excited about the emergence of a Jamaican-owned private asset owner in the infrastructure space in the form of Trans-Jamaica, which is going to be owned by Jamaican institutions and Jamaican individuals shortly. Because having such a private asset owner, that asset owner can start with the East-West Highway, but subject to competitive responses, could end up building other highways, right? But that's for another evening. So, so if I may, Gary, I'll just suffice the 2020 to say, pay attention to the budget in March, and we'll talk about 2020-21 in that context. But so suffice to say that you can expect that the environment, or certainly it is my expectation, that the environment for investment will remain robust and will remain attractive. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much, and I think I'll entertain some questions. Just one fact I want to, and I could add it in the question and answer, but on the labor market, one thing I want to, that's very, very important, is that the gender gap in the labor market is probably the most significant result of our labor change. Most of the employment gains have been female employment. In October of 2016, female unemployment was 17.5%. Male unemployment was 8.6%, for a gender gap of 8.9%. In October 2019, the 17.5% female unemployment collapsed to 8.6%. The male went from 8.9 to 6. So male unemployment 8.6, female unemployment 8.6, male unemployment 6, for a gender gap of 2.6%. So the gender gap was nearly 9%, 8.9, collapsing all the way to 2.6%. This government is good for all Jamaicans, but it's particularly good for females. Yeah?
Thank you, Minister, for that very informative presentation. And I was quite impressed that he didn't accompany any notes. He had all of that in his head. That's quite impressive. All right, so right now is our question and answer segment. And before we open the floor to have our members of the audience ask the minister some questions, we have some questions from our social media page, some Instagram. So we're going to ask you, this one is from Icon. He says, Minister, given the current growth in the economy, the booming performance of the stock market, declining unemployment rate, and the increasing number of tourism arrivals, what are your plans to address income inequality?
You just did.
One, two. Yeah, so, yeah, inequality is something that we ought to be concerned about. Indeed, inequality is a feature that a lot of people around the world are concerned about. What we should understand, however, is that that is not a problem that only started today. We have had a problem with inequality over a long period of time, over decades. And an economy that creates jobs definitely plays a key role in reducing inequality. One of the big features of the poverty that we've had in Jamaica has been because people have not had the opportunity to earn. When you create 100,000 jobs, or you create an environment in which 100,000 private sector jobs emerge in only 4 years, you are taking a sledgehammer to poverty. And yes, in our minds, we'd have the fact that our poverty went up. But you know what? We are measuring it 2 years in 2 years behind. So the numbers that would have come out in 2019 referred to poverty in 2017. Now, in 2017, unemployment was still 12.6%. Are you following me?
Yeah, yeah.
So I am very, very confident that as employment falls, the poverty rate will commensurately fall or fall even faster than unemployment falls. But in addition to relying on private sector employment growth, we have expanded the range of social programs that we have. The budget for social intervention was increased by 25% last year, from 16 billion overall to 20 billion, involving a number of programs and projects. And that expansion of 25% must be measured against overall growth in expenditure of about 4 or 5%. We are also, ensuring that in areas like health and education, access has been broadened. The Minister of Health will tell you of the innovations made in the public health system to allow more persons access to drugs and to medication and persons who can't afford it. So the government is responding, in short, by creating an environment that leads to an environment that is dynamic for private firms and it induces them to employ, right? And because employment reduces poverty and inequality. But we're also expanding our social programs to include those who are in the poverty space. And thirdly, we are investing in health and education and in local government to increase the quality of public services and to ensure that we impact on this thing of on inequality. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Minister. We have one more question from a follower on Instagram. This is from Genuine Genius. They're saying, has the government looked at the feasibility of eliminated PAYE and focus on indirect taxes? That's one of them. So somebody's excited about that. Also, to promote investment and wealth creation, would you consider a dividend tax threshold? I don't know. Yeah, it's. I think the person. Leave that alone. Other than Trans Jamaica, JPS, and Jamaica Mortgage Bank, what other assets are being planned for divestment on the JSE, and what are the timelines?
So on the first question, that's a legitimate question. There are other countries in the Caribbean who have pursued that model, and in fact, the country there's a correlation, even though there may be no causation, that the countries that have that model are far more prosperous than Jamaica is. The facts are that after the 1.5 initiative, persons who actually pay income tax from their emoluments in a PAYE system constitute a small minority of the total employed base. I think the number is probably less than a small number, maybe less than 25%. So it's a reasonable question, but the challenge is that from that 25%, we still get a fair amount, and replacing that would require a lot of thought and a lot of consideration, and consideration would also have to be given to alleviating whatever impact such a measure would have on those who are at the bottom of the spectrum, meaning that we would have to have a much more targeted social intervention program where we can specifically target the persons who are in need. But it is not It's not, it's a legitimate question and one that can't be totally off of the table. But I think that to do that right now probably wouldn't be feasible for the reasons I mentioned, but it's something that we could continue to talk about.
And the second part of the question is about any more
Okay, so
divestments.
yeah, the government has a number of assets, and the idea is, you know, one of the recommendations the government has embraced is that it doesn't make sense for us to be suffocating on the, you know, while we have all these assets that are being underutilized. And so one of the early recommendations to the UDC and to the Factories Corporation of Jamaica was to divest 15 or 20% of their assets. And we're still pursuing that. The UDC has, you know, real estate assets that could be put into an SPV and listed, non-performing real estate assets that would have to be developed. And there are also projects that the Factories Corporation are working on, and I've heard the Prime Minister make the announcement that once those are developed, they would seek private, you know, further private participation through an IPO. So in short, you can, I think the government could bring to market after these that I mentioned, certain maybe real estate assets in the form of a SPV that's listed on the stock market.
Okay, thank you very much, Minister. Well, I now invite members of the audience to pose their questions. We just have two rules. When you come to the microphone in the aisle, just state your name, ask one or two questions, no speeches. Can go ahead.
Lipton Matthew. So this is a question. In light of recent proposals by the JMEA and the PSOJ to promote sound trade and regulatory policies, do you think that there is a need for a local economic reform program transcending administration? In other words, a Jamaican phase of the IMF program to promote freer markets and freer trade and ensure that politicians stick to these policies, i.e. getting rid of deadweight government agencies. Many of them are really deadweight.
Thank you, Lipton. I mean, there's no doubt that there is room for substantial regulatory reform. You know, for us to flourish in the way we want, we need an environment where the small business that only employs 5 persons or 7 persons doesn't have to spend half a day getting certificates from 4 different agencies in order to be able to import. I mean, that is a drag on productivity. And there are many other examples like that. So the short answer to your question is absolutely. We are 100% committed to that kind of reform. The limiting factor is resources and capacity, but I would say that the next phase of our economic reforms will be centered upon those kind of microeconomic changes.
My question here, I don't need to use the mic, I'm a lecturer. I'm a finance and business strategist, and essentially it's just a rider from the releasing more disposable income into the hands of the Jamaican taxpayer, so that at the end of the day they can spend at will.
It's a very big class, so I think you should use a mic.
It's just a rider from the income tax deductions thing. Essentially, what I'm basically saying is that we need to find a way to release more disposable income into the hands of the taxpayers. I'm not suggesting a deletion of the income tax. What I'm basically saying, increase it to 2.5 at the lower band and 8 million at the higher band, and do it on a phase basis so that we can release more disposable income into the hands of consumers so that they can spend at will. And that will increase the GCT consumption, and the rest is history. Yeah? So I think that's something that is worthy of commendation and further analysis. Yeah?
Yeah, we can add it to the things that we analyze. You know, we analyze everything.
I've done the
All the
numbers.
Ministry of
I've done the
Finance.
numbers. And I've spoken to Cruikshank at MOFP and my colleagues at the Mona School of Business and Management. Yeah? And it's feasible.
Thank you.
Minister, she wants a 2.5.
Absolutely.
Good night. The name is George Young. Minister, you spoke about inequality and income inequality. What about disabled people?
But that is a very, very good question. And one of the embarrassments to successive administrations in Jamaica is that a building as central to our life as the Parliament of Jamaica does not have access to persons who have mobility challenges. For sure, with the new Parliament building that's been constructed, that will be a thing of the past. If we are to develop and grow and prosper, we have to embrace all Jamaicans. Jamaicans who are older, Jamaicans who are younger, Jamaicans who are returning, Jamaicans who never left, disabled Jamaicans and able-bodied Jamaicans. And, but that only comes through implementing policy that works and policy that, so what I'd say to you is the government is committed in tangible ways to addressing some of the challenges that are faced within the envelope of resources that we have. And it's going to start, I think the signature thing, we're going to make a big signature thing of it, that a Parliament building will become accessible to persons. But we need to go beyond that. We need to go way, way beyond that. Yes. Yes. So look, give me the name again? George, you are spot on. One of the things that Jamaica is begging for reform in a number of areas. And one area that we have to reform is our labor market. Our labor market is very, very rigid. And the rigidity of it impacts employment. Unemployment could be lower if we had a labor market that was more flexible and a labor market that embraced technology. Yes, that a work day is not 9 to 5. A work day can just be 40 hours comprised in any way that the 40 hours can be delivered. And it doesn't have to be in a fixed place. It can be from somewhere else. And so those are on the agenda, and they're on the agenda because there are serious problems that are arising because of that rigidity. And we have no choice but to address it. So I would say to you that when we're going to address the labor market rigidity, this conversation, to the extent I have influence over it, that we're going to have to ensure that it embraces the disabled community as well. I want to thank you for your question and your point, which I think is spot on.
Good afternoon, Minister. My name's Cavell Haas. I just got one quick question. To me, it seems kind of foolhardy to divest the Jamaica's 20% stake in JPS, because when you consider that the Japanese and South Korea owns the other 80%, I mean, why divest that? If nothing else, couldn't you at least? Because I think I read an article where Jamaica is trying to, they owe like a $6 to $7 million light bill. So that's why they wanted to divest to get the funds for that. So
I'm happy to say, that we have paid for a long time. Jamaica had obligations to the Jamaica Public Service Company in the form of trade payables. I'm happy to say that under this administration, we have brought our arrears to the Jamaica Public Service Company from central government to zero, for street lights at least, okay? So we don't owe them anything. With respect to your question, we're going to divest it to the Jamaican public. So instead of the instead of the government of Jamaica owning the 19.9% stake, it will be you. It will be the public of Jamaica owning the 19.9%.
who's to say what portion of that 19% going to actually own? Like, for example, like Wigton, for example. I think, if I remember correctly, I don't think there was any, like, for example, I think I ordered like 4 million shares, right? So who's to say someone with 50 million US, for example, from another country, coming and buying all those shares?
No,
See?
because the way in which the shares will be distributed in an IPO won't make that possible. The IPO will make sure that people who apply for small amounts get those small amounts before the person who applies for a large amount. Right? So the divestment strategy will ensure that Jamaicans own that 19.9%. But at the end of the day, once the regulatory environment is sound and it's agile and it's on its toes, it doesn't really matter the identity of the owners. Right? As long as the regulatory environment can ensure that the owners have a management that deliver on the mandate and on the license of JPS, that is all that we really need. So the regulatory environment is where we are focused, and making sure that going forward, JPS, our regulators, the OUR, is sufficiently strengthened and has a capacity to ensure that JPS delivers to its customers.
All right, thank you.
Good night, Dr. Clark. David Rose. Two questions. The first one is, as you mentioned the regulatory environment earlier, will there be reforms considered in the future? Because I remember prior there was a discussion for an investment document to discuss or outline ways to make investing easier in Jamaica. Because on one hand you have the regulators such as FSC, which are, I wouldn't say struggling, not a very correct term, but I'm not sure how they will manage based on our growing environment, not just towards the equities market, but towards other securities markets as well, which include other products such as futures and options, which will be coming in the future. So, in regards to that, what reforms can be done in order to ensure that the regulators themselves can manage to take on that level of work?
So if I understand your question, what are we doing to ensure that the regulators have the capacity to match the growth in the security sector? That's a very good question. That's something that we are very focused on, and in the process of ensuring that we can engage technical assistance from our multilateral partners to ensure that all of our regulators, but with respect to your question, the Financial Services Commission in particular, is resourced, is upskilled, and has the capacity to discharge its functions to the Jamaican people as a regulator of the security sector, and a regulator that does not necessarily stop risk-taking, but one that manages or regulates the taking of risk. We have a lot of work to do in that regard, but it is something that's on the agenda already.
But in consideration is because I asked FSC recently why their two most prior annual reports weren't out, and they said that because the Ministry of Finance, or I should say Parliament, hadn't tabled or reviewed it as yet, which is quite odd. But that's for another day. But on to the second question. As it currently stands, a lot of our sectors, or I should say emerging sectors in both technology, creatives, and other intellectually based areas of new jobs are somewhat hindered based on our, as you would say, trade regime. So if some persons want to import some technology such as cameras or specialized equipment, they are faced with a heavy burden that sometimes a drag or delays them from acquiring those tools. I know that they go into the currently uniform to the Customs Act, and we're supposed to give our submissions, but it relates to allowing for the growth of those new jobs, of those independent individuals. A bit more can be done to facilitate that growth, such that they aren't feeling restricted even by the product, because by the time you reach Jamaica, you have to probably pay twice for what it was worth.
For a country like Jamaica, with an open economy where trade is such a large part of our GDP, the efficiency of border control agencies is crucial to our development, because so much of the economic activity involves stuff passing the borders of Jamaica. And it's for that reason that we are embarked on a very ambitious program to repeal and to replace the Customs Act. And that should play a significant role in advancing that agenda. But in addition, bringing technology to the process of processing of documents to ensure that things can happen a lot more quickly.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
I'm very grateful to Mayberry for this opportunity to pose this question because there are retired teachers living in poverty because they have no pension. Some of them have worked as much as 25 years. And I would really like to know if any consideration is given to the retired teachers and some nurses, but I'm here to speak about the retired teachers.
Excuse me, ma'am, can you give us a name? Can you give us a name just for...
My name is Elaine Salmon Brower, sir. You probably have seen the many letters that I've written to you.
That's what I love about the Mayberry Forum. Stepping into the arena. Thank you for your question, Elaine. Now, let me just explain the background of Elaine's question, which is a very good, there was a time in the teaching profession, sometimes it's hard to explain these things that used to exist, where you would be pensionable, and I won't give the years, if you had a certain years of service, which is normal, but if the years of service as a proportion of the number of years that you worked reached a certain level. So you have instances of persons in the teaching profession who would have worked for 18 years, for example, but their overall working life was 40. They meet one of the thresholds, but the 18 over 40 meant they spent too much time on the teaching, I guess, and so they were not pensionable under the old regime. That's not the case today. This was a pension arrangement for teachers that I believe may have, I don't know how far it went back, but it could have gone back to pre-independence Jamaica coming over. I'm not sure. I'm not sure when it was installed, but it's clearly an aberration when you view it from the lens of today. As a result of that, the Ministry of Finance has looked, will look favorably on individual cases where that exists, okay? So if the persons who are so affected were to write to the Ministry of Finance and expressing the, no. She may write about other things she's talking about. We have had several examples. Let me put it the other way. We have had several examples of on an individual basis, something being made available. Clearly, while we are and have to be very sympathetic to those cases, they're a result of laws that we didn't put in place and are from a different era and a different time. The good news is that that does not exist today. There was a reform to the pension system, public pension system that came into place in 2017 that amalgamated the disparate pieces of pension legislation. We had pension for teachers, pension for police, pension act for nurses, pension act for, this government agency. There were over 30 pieces of legislation governing pension in Jamaica. Can you believe that? Public sector pension. We repealed all of them and replaced them with one single act with the same terms and conditions for everybody, except for parliamentarians, whose contribution rate is higher than everybody else. So that is no longer the case. But certainly for the historical ones, where there are persons who are affected, for the, for the strongest of those cases, we have made some awards.
Andrew Pierman from Anvil. The government had embarked upon a policy, and I have to tell you, I bat for SMEs, that would allow SMEs to benefit from the government being the largest provider of goods and services in the economy. How is that preferential program working?
Thank you. So what he's referring to is that in September, we passed 2 procurement orders. One of them that reserves 20% of the Government of Jamaica procurement budget for SMEs. And the other one deals with a margin of preference for Jamaican firms on international competitive bidding that gives them the opportunity to compete against their international counterparts. With respect to the one for SMEs that I described first, we have embarked upon it for a select group of ministry departments and agencies. I think we're starting with about 12 or 15, I could be wrong on the exact number, to iron out the kinks, to make sure that it works before we expand it to include all of Jamaica. We're running that pilot for a minimum period of time. We get the results, understand what the challenges, what the problems are to it, and what we need to tweak, how we need to make it better. But it is in place now, and it is working with a subset of the public sector. I can give you the names of the entities who have it in place. And as soon as the results of those pilot indicate that it is good to be rolled out for all ministries, departments, and agencies, then we will embark on that.
Good night, Minister. I'm able on foot. I had dinner the other day with some very scholarly folks, and one of them made a very outlandish statement. And for the life of me, and with the greatest stretch of the imagination, I couldn't understand why they would say that. And the statement was the government plans to do away with the junior market. I mean, I know of many success stories of the junior market, so I'm just asking you for confirmation that that is not so.
There are no plans that I'm aware of to do that.
All right, I take it that's the last question. All right.
Good evening, everyone. So I just have 2 quick questions, Mr. Minister. One has to do with the upcoming maturities this year. So there is upwards about 89 billion due to mature this year. And I just want to know if you can indicate, even at this early stage, what percentage of that amount is the government likely to mop up? And secondly, with respect to the water infrastructure, you had mentioned there will be greater investments both via private participation and via the government in terms of investing in the water infrastructure projects. What unique or special plans are there in place for this year, this calendar year?
Okay, with respect to the first question, that's all been worked out now. I mean, it's a whole part of the budgetary process. So it would be premature for me to give any indication because those numbers are being processed as we speak. But by the beginning of the financial year, you will be aware of what the plans are. With respect to the second, you're asking the nature of the project, what's the nature of what projects could be? Well, projects would range from the sewage treatment plants, for example. The other half of water is sewage. And we have sewage treatment plants that the government owns, that it doesn't need to own. We have minority shareholders, and once we work out the arrangements with minority shareholders, the government would be open to private participation in that. But in terms of new projects, Jamaica needs to lay new pipes, it needs to build storage capacity, and the pipes meaning distribute. So we need to build storage, we need to build pumps and treatment, and we need to build distribution. And in those three areas, those are areas in which once the modalities are properly worked out, we could have private participation. I'm not saying that any of that is going to happen now, but I'm saying that is where that's where our minds are going to have to be focused, because the numbers involved are just too large.
Would be the Rio Cobre project then, in terms of expanding water supply or capacity. There are no other...
well, no, there are many other projects. I mean, the Rio Cobra, and then the project to lay the pipes all the way coming in on the Mandela across Marcus Garvey and intersections of Kingston and St. Andrew. That's a major project that the Prime Minister announced that's going to get underway in the next financial year. And then, yes, the one of expanding the Rio Cobre. So we're working on the distribution and the storage in those two examples.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you. Let us give the Minister a hand for answering the question. Well, to show our appreciation to our special guest, we'd like to present you with a token. I now invite Amita Prasad, Investment Advisor, to present the Minister a gift. But at this time, I would like to invite Shane Hossett, Senior Investment Advisor, to give the vote of thanks.
Dr. the Honorable Nigel Clark, thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to come and instill confidence in us. And we know that based on the presentation that you have made, we are looking for a very good Jamaican economy for 2020, and I know we're all looking for a very vibrant market in 2020. The audience, Mayberry's investors, thank you all for coming out this evening. I know that every one of you will make good of every opportunity that comes your way for 2020, and let it be a very prosperous one for you all. And thanks again for coming out. Ladies and gentlemen, let me invite back our host, Executive Advisor Floyd Wilson, who will take over for the rest of the business.
All right. Thank you, thank you. And Shane is on the prosperity train, you know. So I want to thank you all for coming. Invite you. Hope to see you at the next Investment Advisor Investment Forum. Just enjoy some of our refreshments before you go. Good night, everybody.